Welcome to Terran Apex Protocol, where the galaxy keeps underestimating humanity and keeps regretting it. If these stories are your kind of story, subscribe and stay with us. My name's Atlas. Tonight, an unarmed white ship drifts into a graveyard of 10,000 enemies and starts collecting their dead one by one, learning their names and sending them home, and it brings an empire to its knees doing it. Let's begin. The gunner had been dead for 6 weeks, and Chief Registrar Naomi Reyes handled him like he might still bruise. She braced her boots against the sheared rib of the gun mount and eased the body back along the grain of the wreck. The way you draw a splinter, never against the bias. 40 minutes she had worked this one loose. The Krev built their gun cradles tight, and the hit had folded this one around its crew, like a fist closing. Reyes cut nothing she did not absolutely have to cut. Cutting was for salvage crews, and this was not salvage. "There," she said. "There you are." The body came free into the open dark, turning slowly, and she gathered it in and let her tether take the load. Past her faceplate, the stars over Tarsus Drift were hard little points, and the wreckage ran out in every direction farther than her lamps could throw. 10,212 Krev had died here. 1,940 humans had died with them. 6 weeks ago, this had been a battle. Now it was a field, and she was working it. She turned the gunner with 2 fingers under the collar plate and found the glyph cut there, the way Krev soldiers carried their names into the dark. She had learned the script in her first month aboard, the same way she had learned 40 other scripts. Because you do not touch a people's dead until you can say who they were. "Cavett," she read aloud. "Gun second, 9th battery. All right, Cavett. Let's get you home." No one had spoken that name since the battle. No one on the Krev worlds would ever speak it again, because Cavett had died in vacuum, and Krev doctrine held that the void unwrites whatever it takes. No body, no right, no name. Somewhere on a farm moon, his family would already be wearing the blank ash band that announced a son had existed once and must never be mentioned again. Reyes had read their theology cover to cover before the long home ever made the jump. She had decided, the same way her service had decided 3 centuries ago, that it changed nothing about the job. She clipped the identification tag to the cradle and sealed the effects pouch. 1 carved field token. 1 cracked vision lens, 1 letter never sent. Then she keyed her comm. Recovery 1 to long home, 1 more coming up. Gun second, 9th battery, collar glyph intact. He goes to Dr. Cole first. The cradle held him kindly, but the deck did not. "Copy that, Chief," the Bay Tech answered. "He makes 211 today." A kilometer behind her, lit like a chapel at midnight, her ship lay station-keeping in the ruin. The CNS Long Home was painted white from bow to stern, and she carried no weapons at all. Every running light burned steady instead of blinking, because a blinking light asks a question, and the Long Home was an answer. She was a mortuary vessel of the Graves Registration Service. Her standing orders were older than human spaceflight, and they fit in 3 words: no one drifts. The war itself had moved on 2 systems over and was still grinding, hot as the day it started. Out here there was only the slow work. Human recovery teams and Krev dead, tray after tray, name after name, 11 hours a shift, 6 weeks and counting. Some of the crew kept count on the bulkhead by the bay doors, 1 small chalk line for every soul brought in, and nobody ever called the tally morbid. They called it the only arithmetic that mattered. Reyes was reaching for the next buckled plate when the proximity alarm tripped in her helmet. Above the field, the dark tore open, and a Krev picket squadron came through the breach with every weapon already live. Shipmaster Tarn had made the jump expecting looters. Every spacefaring species knew the pattern. A battlefield cooled, the fleets moved on, and the carrion trade came creeping in to cut alloy, strip reactor cores, and pry trophies off the drifting dead. His orders from the War Council were simple, and he had relished them. Catch the scavengers over the bones of Tarsus drift, and burn them where they float. What his screens showed him instead was an unarmed white ship parked dead center in the debris field, with its lights burning steady. Around it, dozens of small human figures moved through the wreckage with a patience that made no commercial sense. Not one cutting torch was lit anywhere in the field. He watched a single human spend 11 unbroken minutes freeing one Krev body from a crushed gun cradle, and then hold it, and then appear to speak to it. "Shipmaster," his sensor officer said quietly. "They are not stripping the alloy. As far as we can determine, they are taking only the dead." Tarn stared at the screen, and the old ash-script lines of his household dead felt suddenly heavy on his carapace. Every Krev wore those lines, names written in fired ash, one for each kinsman given proper right on solid ground. The lines were the family. What the void took was never written, and what was never written had never been. "Then that is worse than looting," Tarn said. "Stand by to board." The Long Home answered the boarding demand by opening her main bay doors and turning on every light she had. Tarn led the detachment himself, 12 Marines in breach armor, weapons charged, moving in the tight stack they used for pirate hulks. He knew what they would find. He had stormed enough scavenger ships to know the smell of a trophy hold, the racks of polished carapace plates, the jars. His claws ached for it. Righteous work was rare in a long war, and shooting grave robbers over the bones of his own people was as righteous as work came. A human woman in a gray duty uniform met them at the bay threshold, with her hands empty and open. She was small even for the species, with silver threading the black of her tied-back hair. And she looked at the guns the way a teacher looks at rain through a window. "Chief Registrar Naomi Reyes," she said. "You're the picket commander." "Good, we hoped you'd come yourself. The decks run cold where we're going. Your optics may fog. Follow me." She turned her back on 12 loaded weapons and walked. After a moment, feeling the entire shape of the encounter slide out from under him, Tarn followed. She led them down a long corridor and through a pressure arch, and the hall beyond ran the full length of the ship's spine, and his Marines went very quiet behind him. Cold lockers lined the hall from deck to ceiling, on both sides, rank after rank, lit soft white. Each locker carried a placard with a Krev name, rendered in careful Krev script. Where trays stood open for processing, he could see Krev soldiers washed clean of the field, limbs composed, a sealed pouch of effects at each shoulder, a written page clipped at each set of feet. The hall went on. It kept going on. Tarn walked 100 paces and could not see the end of it. "What is this place?" he said. His translator chewed on the human answer and offered him morgue, then archive, then sanctuary, and committed to none of them. "We call it the Long Hall," Reyes said. "Your people are resting in it. 4,106 so far. The rest are still out in the field, and we will get to every one of them we can reach." One of his Marines reached toward a placard and stopped with his gauntlet a hand-width short, the way you stop at the lip of a fire. Tarn understood the hesitation in his own plates. The names were right there, written. Public. Spoken into being by alien hands. "You wrote their names," he said. "You wrote the names of the unwritten." "We wrote the names of your dead," Reyes said. "Every species writes something. We learned your script first, so we would write it correctly." She walked to a lectern at the head of the hall and laid her hand on a bound volume nearly the size of a hatch cover, its spine worn pale with handling. "This is the ledger," she said. "Master register. Every recovery, every identification, every effect, every cause of death we can establish, and a death account in plain language for the family. It goes where they go, home." "Heresy," Tarn said. The word came out of him before any thought did. "Every name in this hall is scripture broken. The void unwrites what it takes." "That is not a custom, Registrar. It is the load-bearing wall of my entire civilization." "I've read your scripture," Reyes said. "All 9 cantos. We can argue about walls after the work is done. He was forming the order to seize the ship when she checked the manifest slate at the lectern. She looked up at him with something he would spend years learning to read on a human face. "Your picket flies 3rd Fleet glyphs," she said. "Then you'll want row 60. We brought in a gun second this morning whose household glyph matches yours along the mother line. Cavett, 9th Battery." I tagged him myself. Row 60 held a tray like all the others. The placard said Cavett. The page at his feet said the 9th Battery had lost containment, and that gun second Cavett had stayed in the cradle and vented his chamber by hand. 3 of his crew had reached the pods alive because of it. Tarn read it twice. He had last seen Cavett as a yearling at a harvest festival, motherline, 2nd remove, a small loud creature falling out of a roof tree. When the casualty rolls came, Tarn had tied on the blank ash band and not said the name, because there was no name. That was the law of it. The boy had been unwritten. The page in front of him said otherwise in 2 scripts. Mineral beads welled up from the seams of Tarn's carapace and ran down the plates, his body weeping the way Krev bodies wept, and he could not stop it in front of his own Marines. "He was my kin," Tarn said. "I know," Reyes said. "The glyph told us. Somebody has to take him home. Shipmaster, and the law of my service says it should be family." Tarn had come to stop grave robbers. He stood in the cold hall and understood there was no word in his language for what these creatures were, because no species had ever needed one. The order from War Prelate Ausk arrived 3 days later, burst-coded, priority of the War Council itself. Tarn played it 4 times alone in his cabin before he carried it across. The humans were no scavengers, the order said. They were waging theological warfare, manufacturing ghosts, writing the unwritten back into the world to break the ascendancy's spine from inside its own homes. The white ship would cease, withdraw, and surrender its blasphemous registry, or it would be destroyed with all hands. Tarn delivered it standing in the Longholm's Bay, reading from the slate, his own translator flattening the liturgy into something that sounded, in human language, almost embarrassed. Reyes heard him out. Then she pulled up her own slate and turned it so he could see the field plot, 7,106 markers, still glowing amber in the wreck. "That's how many of your people are still out there," she said. "We're not done. So here's my answer, and you can transmit it in whatever cant the man requires. Fire when you need to. We're not done working." "You do not understand what you are refusing," Tarn said. "Ausk is not a man who blinks. He buried nothing in this field, and he will burn it clean." His own son's gun went silent at Tarsus Drift, and the war prelate tied on the blank band the same hour and has not spoken the boy's name since. "A man who can do that to himself will have no trouble doing worse to you." "Then he knows exactly what this field costs," Reyes said. "Transmit it anyway." For 9 days afterward, the picket squadron held station with its lances trained on the white ship, and the white ship went on, working under the guns as if they were weather. Tarn's gunnery officers ran their drills and said nothing. Then they began, one by one, to find reasons to be elsewhere during the firing exercises. It was not mutiny, it was arithmetic. Every targeting solution they refreshed was a solution for burning a hull with 4,000 of their own children sleeping in its spine. Tarn told himself it was intelligence work when he requisitioned copies of the death accounts. He read them at night, 1 tray at a time, gun crews and hull menders, and a cook who had carried 2 wounded to the pods and gone back for a 3rd. By the 2nd week, he had read 240 of them. And he had stopped calling it intelligence work even inside his own head. The recovery bay ran quietest on 3rd shift, and that was when Specialist Theo Brandt liked to do his cataloging. He was 22, the youngest registrar aboard, and he talked to the dead while he worked, which was against no regulation anyone had ever bothered to write. "Easy now," he told a Krev hull mender whose effects he was sealing. That's your good wrench. I know it. It rides right here next to you. Dr. Amani Cole, passing with her cart, observed that Brant was the only man she knew who apologized to people for the temperature of a scanner. Somebody should, Brant said. She did not argue, because the dark humor of registrars is 9 parts tenderness, and everyone aboard knew it. Reyes was at the bay desk, closing the day's pages when Brant brought over his slate to be countersigned. He hovered. He was bad at hovering. "Chief, can I ask you something off the record?" he said. "I was in the master file pulling disposition codes for the audit. 11 years of your entries, every field on every line. You've never once written lost, not one time. The code exists. You've never used it." Reyes signed the slate and set the stylus down. "My brother flew search and rescue," she said. "Marcus Reyes. His bird went down at Halsey Deep 11 years ago, and the fleet searched 9 days and called it. No recovery. There's a chair at my mother's table nobody has sat in since," she went on. "And there's a line in my own ledger, the family one, the paper one, that I keep blank. The day I write lost on somebody else's child, I've agreed lost is a real disposition. It isn't. I don't write lost. Lost means somebody stopped looking." Brant was quiet for a moment, which was rare enough that she looked up at him. "We'll fill it someday, Chief," he said. "The line. Somebody will pull his tag out of that field, you watch. Get some sleep, Theo," she said. And he grinned and went, and the bay hummed along on its 3rd shift business of sending strangers home. The first repatriation convoy left 12 days later, a neutral courier under a white pennant, carrying 41 Krev home along a corridor Tarn had cleared on his own authority and would answer for later. Cavett rode in the first hull. With him went his effects pouch and the honor letter Reyes had written in both scripts. It told his family plainly how the 9th Battery had died and how 3 of its crew had lived. It ended with the sentence her service had ended such letters with for 300 years. He was not left behind. The courier's feed from the farm moon was never meant to be public. Someone leaked it within the hour, and afterward, no power in the ascendancy could pull it back. It showed a Krev mother standing in the doorway of a low stone farmhouse, while soldiers carried her son's casket up the path through rows of grain. It showed her take the blank ash band off her arm and drop it in the dust. Then she dipped 2 claws in the right bowl her own mother handed her, and she reached up to the doorpost of the house. In fired ash, in full public view of the road and the neighbors, and the recording drone and the entire watching galaxy, she wrote his name. "Cavett," the doorpost said. "Of this house." The feed crossed 100 worlds in a day. By the 3rd day, blank-banded mothers were standing in prefecture squares from the core to the rim, holding up their empty arms, saying nothing. Their silence asked where their own children were, and who exactly had decided they were not allowed to come home. The War Council called it human psychological warfare, and the home front cracked anyway, along a seam no admiral had ever mapped. The doctrine said the void unwrites. The feed from the farm moon showed a name being written back. The worst of the field was the carrier Vorth's crown, or what 6 lance hits had left of her. Her aft third had burned with the reactor. Dr. Cole's survey had drawn a hard red line around the fused compartments and the roughly 200 Krebs sealed inside them, beyond any tool or any patience, forever. Reyes had stood at the survey table a long time before she signed that line. "We name them on a wall then," she said. "If we can't bring them out, we can still write them down." Cole noted it in the plan, and the plan moved on, because grief on a mortuary ship is a scheduled activity, and the schedule was 9 weeks deep. Forward of the red line lay the gun decks, and the gun decks were slow, ugly work. The hits had fused cradle to crew to deck plating. Every recovery was an hour of cutting heat and shoring jacks and hands working by feel inside collapsed machinery. Brant volunteered for it daily. He was good at it, small-handed and patient, and he kept up a low, one-sided conversation with every soldier he untangled. "You're all right. Almost there. Your people are waiting." Cole tried twice to rotate him off the duty, on the grounds that nobody should live on that deck. Brant appealed both times. "Chief," he argued at the rotation board, "somebody who likes them should do it." Reyes looked at the kid for a while, 22 years old and asking to keep the hardest job on the manifest. Then she signed the waiver, and she would carry that signature for the rest of her life. On the 53rd day, working the 4th battery of the Vorth's Crown, Brant got his shoulders under a fallen cradle arm and eased a gunner free. Behind him, something the survey had missed, shifted in the wreckage. A Krev ship-killer round, thrown loose at the moment of the carrier's death and sleeping in the debris for 9 weeks, slid down 2 meters of buckled deck and woke up. The blast threw him 40 meters clear of the hull. His suit held its air. The rest of him did not. Everyone in the recovery bay knew it from the moment the team brought him in, and nobody said it. And Cole worked on him for an hour anyway, because that is also a right. Reyes held his hands. They were the smallest hands on the crew, and they had pulled 300 strangers out of the dark. "Did we get him loose?" Brant asked. The gunner. "We got him, Theo. You cleared him. He's in the queue." "Good," he said. "That's good. Tell my mom it was a job worth doing. Write it like that, Chief. Exactly like that. She'll want it in writing." "You can tell her yourself," Reyes said, and he smiled at her for trying. A while later, quietly, between one breath and the one that never followed it, Specialist Theo Brant died in the bay where he had worked, surrounded by the people he had worked it with. The long home stopped. For one full day, for the first time in 9 weeks, the white ship's recovery teams came inside and the field lay still. The crew did for their own what they had crossed a war to do for strangers. They washed him and composed him and sealed his effects, his good stylus, his bad harmonica, his unfinished letter to a girl on Mars. They laid him on a tray in the long hall among the 10,000 he had been bringing home. By the bay doors, where the chalk tally climbed the bulkhead in neat rows of 5, somebody drew one line apart from all the others and ruled a small box around it. Nobody ever washed that bulkhead again. The Krev picket watched all of it. Tarn stood at his scope for most of that day and could not look away from the simple, impossible arithmetic of it. The human had died untangling Krev, dead from a Krev wreck, that the Krev themselves had abandoned, and the humans did not seem to find this strange. They grieved him the way they worked, thoroughly, by hand, missing nothing. On Tarn's own gun deck, the duty crews stood away from their boards without being ordered to, and the shipmaster logged no reprimand. At ship's dusk, Tarn put on his vacuum harness, walked out onto his own hull alone, and faced the white ship across 40 kilometers of grave. Every Krev officer on watch saw what he did next, and he knew they saw it, and he did it anyway. He spoke a name to the void in the right cadence of his grandmother's liturgy, the cadence reserved for the written dead. The name was Theo Brant. The grief came up through his plates the way Krev grief always did, and in the vacuum, it froze where it surfaced, sheathing him in a pale second armor, and he stood in it and finished the cantos. Then he crossed to the long home and found Reyes at the bay desk with the ledger open in front of her, and stood before her the way one stands before a tribunal. "Your man died untangling my cousin's people from the wreck we abandoned," Tarn said. "We have 10,000 words for war, registrar, and not one for what your ship is. I am beginning to think that is the whole indictment of us." Reyes looked at him for a moment. "Sit down, shipmaster," she said. "I'm writing Theo's account. You can help me get the Krev parts right." So he sat, and he helped. They worked through the night watch, the human writing, the Krev correcting the cant of his own liturgy line by line, and the account was written in 2 scripts like all the others. Under disposition, in her own hand, Reyes wrote recovered, going home, to his mother, with honors. She did not write lost. She had never once written it in 11 years, and she was not going to start with Theo Brandt, who had promised her, in this same bay, that every blank line gets filled someday. The work resumed at dawn, because Brandt would have hated the alternative. Reyes took his place on the gun decks herself and would accept no waiver board for it, and the queue moved again, tray after tray, hour after hour. 4 days later, the next tray in the queue carried a gun lieutenant. The name on the collar glyph was Vale. Reyes ran the household glyph twice, because the first result seemed like the universe overreaching. Warline, first remove. Son of War Prelate Ausk. War Prelate Ausk came to Tarsus Drift with 9 ships of the line and the War Council's seal to erase a heresy at its root. He had written the operational order himself. The white ship would be given 1 transmission's worth of mercy, and then the lances would restore the unwriting, and the field would be glassed until nothing in it could ever be named again. His first act in system was to relieve Shipmaster Tarn of station. Your picket will withdraw to the outer marker, the order read. Your conduct file follows separately. Tarn withdrew exactly 4 kilometers and logged a protest in the squadron record where no clerk could quietly delete it. Then he trained every passive sensor he had on the white ship, because whatever happened next, somebody loyal to the truth ought to be watching. The ultimatum gave the Longholm 20 minutes to abandon ship. Reyes read it at the bay desk, then keyed the all-hands channel. You heard the man, she said. Boats are on the rail. Anyone who wants to go, goes. No mark against them, I'll sign it personally. You have my count of 10. She counted to 10 on the open channel. Nobody moved anywhere on the ship. Cole's report came up from the long haul a moment later, dry as a manifest. All teams reported. Nobody left their stations, Chief. Several would like the record to show they find the question insulting. On the flagship, the lance batteries began their charging cycle, and the white hull centered itself in 9 targeting plots, and the firing clock started at 6 minutes. Reyes did not hail the fleet. She did not address the feeds, though half the galaxy's relays were straining at Tarsus Drift by then. She opened a narrow beam to the flagship alone, marked private, marked for the war prelate's eyes, sender Graves registration, and she transmitted a single document of 9 pages. It was a death account, written in 2 scripts. It said that Gun Lieutenant Vale, 4th Battery Commander of the carrier Vorth's Crown, had still been alive when the carrier lost her drives. It said his battery had power left for either its own guns or its own escape. Vale had ordered every remaining watt cross-fed into the failing shield lattice of the troop carrier limping past below him. The troop carrier had crossed into jump shadow with 1,140 souls aboard, every one of whom was alive today. His last logged words, sent to his gun crew while the deck went dark around them, were "Hold the feed steady, they're almost across." The last page was an invitation. "Your son is with us," it said. "He has been washed and named, and his effects are sealed, and his account is written. Before you fire, you are invited aboard for the viewing. Come alone if you want," the page went on. "We will perform it as your right, not ours. Everybody given right may be written. Your own 9th canto, War Prelate." We checked. The firing clock reached 4 minutes and stopped. For 3 more minutes, the flagship hung silent. Guns charged and aimed, while behind its hull, plating a man who had not spoken his son's name in 9 weeks, read 9 pages twice. Then a single shuttle detached from the flagship's spine, unescorted, and crossed the grave alone. Aus came up the Longholm's ramp in full prelate's armor with the blank ash band on his arm. The humans did not search him, and the deference of that was its own kind of violence. Reyes met him the way she had met Tarn, with empty hands. "This way," she said. "Nothing else." He had expected speeches. There were no speeches anywhere in the white ship. There was only the long hall opening ahead of him rank by rank. 4,000 of his own people sleeping in clean light with their names announced beside them. The silence of the place pressed on his doctrine harder than any argument the humans could have made. Vale's tray stood ready at the heart of the hall. Reyes had prepared the rite herself from the Krev liturgy, the bowl of fired ash mixed and warmed, the cantos printed phonetically on a card in her own handwriting in case her pronunciation failed her. It did not fail her. She spoke the right cadence of a species that had aimed 9 ships at her, and she got it right, and then she stepped back and gave the war prelate room. Ausk stood over his son for a long time. "I gave the order that committed his squadron to this field," he said at last. "And when the rolls came in, I tied on the band and forbade his name, because the only other choice was to hear it. Doctrine is a mercy, Registrar. It numbs what cannot be survived. I have enforced that numbness on 400 worlds, and I called it faith. And my son lay here in the cold the whole time, 9 weeks, while his father forbade the galaxy to remember him. He saved 1,140 people," Reyes said. "The account is yours. So is he." Ausk's claws shook as he drew off the gauntlet. Mineral beads broke from every seam of his carapace at once and ran down the prelate's armor, and he let them run, and he dipped 2 bare claws in the offered ash. On his own carapace, over his hearts, in the place where doctrine itself was written, the keeper of the unwriting wrote his son's name. "Vael," the script read, "of my house. Given right among the humans." Then he straightened and keyed his comm, and what he said next went out unencrypted on the open channel. It went to 9 ships of the line, to Tarn's distant picket, to the straining relays, to the War Council listening in the dark of the core worlds. "This is War Prelate Ausk," he said. "Every fleet in this galaxy abandons its fallen. No fleet ever returns for its dead. This unarmed ship returned for ours. They stopped a war to bury 10,000 of our children. Stand down, all of you." Across 9 ships of the line, the lances discharged cold, one battery after another, like candles going out. Only the sword captain of the Iron Canticle kept her battery hot, and on the open channel she named Ausk a heretic and refused the order to her last breath of authority. For 9 seconds, the unwriting had 1 defender left. Then her own gun crews powered the lance down around her, hand by hand, until she commanded a cold ship and a silent bridge, and the war was over whether she signed it or not. At the outer marker, 4 kilometers past where he had been ordered, Shipmaster Tarn watched his squadron's threat board go dark and found that he could not see it clearly. On the flagship's gun decks, crews stood away from their boards the way his own had done, unbidden, and nobody anywhere logged a reprimand. The War Council convened in emergency session within the hour. The armistice of Tarsus Drift was signed 5 weeks later, and the diplomats on both sides were privately baffled by it because it ceded no territory and traded no fleets. Its first article was a repatriation schedule. Its second was a corridor map for mortuary ships. Both flags guaranteed safe passage through any front for the rest of the war and after it. The historians, who are sometimes wiser than the diplomats, came to call it the Ledger Peace. The fighting 2 systems over sputtered for a season and then starved. It is hard to keep a war fed when 100 worlds of mothers have stopped believing in the doctrine that made their grief illegal. The blank ash band was retired by imperial edict within the year. The edict was 4 lines long, and the 4th line ordered every band already worn to be burned to ash, and the ash to be used for writing. At the red line aboard the Vorth's crown, where the 200 sealed in the fused compartments could never be reached, human and Krev crews together cut a wall of polished hull plate. They engraved every name the rosters held. Reyes signed the survey closed beneath it. It was the only page of the ledger she ever signed with a steady hand and a bad conscience, and she went back twice a year for the rest of her career to read the wall aloud. The Krev Ascendancy founded its own graves service that winter, the first in its history. They called themselves the Rewriters, and the name was chosen by public petition. The first cohort of 40 trained aboard the Long Home under Chief Registrar Naomi Reyes, who taught them the way she had been taught. You do not touch a people's dead until you can say who they were. Shipmaster Tarn, retired from the line at his own request, commanded the cohort. At the founding rite, he stood before his trainees in the long hall and gave them their charge in one breath. We told ourselves the void unrights the fallen because we could not bear to look at what we left there, Tarn said. The humans never believed the void had any such authority. On the human memorial ground at Tarsus Anchor, where the Longhome's own dead were laid down under real grass. At last, the Krev War Squadron asked permission to perform full rite over a single grave. Permission was granted. 10,000 Krev stood in ranks that filled the plain past the fence line and spoke the cantos of the written dead in one cadence, and the name they spoke was Theo Brandt. His mother stood at the front between Reyes and Dr. Cole. She did not understand one word of the liturgy, and she understood the whole of it. Afterward, Ausk himself bent low, so that she could see her son's name in fired ash among the names of the prelate's own house. There was talk of a joint commendation, the first in the history of either fleet, to be presented to Reyes on the floor of the reconvened council, with both anthems played. She read the invitation at the bay desk, thanked the courier, and asked Cole to send regrets. "There's always a next field," Reyes said. "The manifests do." The next field was an old one. Under the second article of the Ledger Peace, the corridor charts opened battlefields that had been closed for decades. Tarn had insisted the debt run in both directions, so the rewriters' first training deployment took them to a human graveyard. 11 years of drift had scattered the wreckage at Halsey Deep into a ring fine as smoke. The cohort worked it the slow way, by hand, by feel, the way the humans had taught them. On the 9th day, a young Krev rewriter rose out of the wreck shadow of a downed rescue bird, with her recovery light blinking green and something small held up in her claw. It was a human identification tag, and the stamp on it had been waiting 11 years for someone to come back and read it. The stamp said Marcus Reyes. Far away aboard the Long Home, in a paper ledger kept in a desk drawer, one line still stood blank. It would not stay blank much longer. 100 worlds were out there looking now, and as the chief registrar could have told anyone, nothing on her books was ever truly lost. Lost only ever meant that somebody had stopped looking, and nobody, anywhere, was stopping. The cohort brought the tag home themselves. 11 Krev in white-striped recovery suits stood solemn and slightly terrified in the Longhome's bay while their youngest laid it in the chief registrar's palm. Reyes closed her hand around her brother. She thanked them in their own script cadence, every syllable correct. If her eyes were wet, her hands were steady, because the manifest was due and the field was waiting, and that was the job. That evening, in the paper ledger in the desk drawer, the oldest open line on her books was F